They looked at him and saw a snack, a frail, fleshy little thing wandering a docking bay built for giants. The alien dock workers clicked their mandibles, laughing at the human's pathetic stature. They thought they could take his ship, his cargo, and his dignity just because they cast a longer shadow. Then they heard the low, rumbling growl echoing from his cargo ramp. They didn't know about Earth's gravity, and they certainly didn't know about man's best friend. The air on Outpost 44 tasted like battery acid and burnt hair. It coated the back of Kevin's throat with a metallic film that no amount of lukewarm ship water could wash away. He stood by the docking terminal, shifting his weight off his bad left knee, listening to the rhythmic, wet thwack of the heavy atmospheric scrubbers, struggling to keep the lower bays breathable. Kevin wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier, a diplomat, or one of those square-jawed pioneers the recruitment vids loved to broadcast back in the core systems. He was 42, chronically sleep-deprived, and hauling 3,000 tons of refined industrial coolant to sectors that didn't care if he lived or died, so long as the cargo manifested on time. He swiped his transit card against the terminal reader. A red light flashed. A sharp, dissonant buzzer echoed through the cavernous loading bay. "Denied," the automated system chirped in a synthetic, painfully cheerful voice. Kevin closed his eyes. He squeezed the bridge of his nose, right where a dull pressure headache was beginning to throb behind his retinas. "Come on," he muttered, the words raspy in his own ears. "Just stamp the damn slip." A shadow fell over him. It wasn't a small shadow. It blocked out the harsh, flickering glare of the overhead halogens completely. Human. The voice was a wet, clicking rasp, translated through a cheap collar synthesizer into a flat baritone. Kevin turned, craning his neck up and up. The portmaster towered at an easy 8.5 feet. His species, the Vaxiri, were a brutal evolutionary crossroad between mantis and monitor lizard. Thick, obsidian scales layered their chests, leading up to 4 multi-jointed arms that twitched with restless predatory energy. The translation software on Kevin's rig had arbitrarily assigned the alien the moniker Brutus, a cruel irony given the creature's sheer mass and the violent, jerky way he moved. Brutus leaned down. He smelled overwhelmingly of ammonia and spoiled meat. Kevin forced himself not to step back, though his heart did a sudden, uncomfortable stutter in his chest. His palms went slick with cold sweat. It was an involuntary biological response to being severely, hopelessly outmatched on the food chain. "Transit papers are frozen," Brutus clicked, the synthesizer struggling to capture the sneer in the alien's vocalizations. "Your vessel is inadequate. The biological shielding is out of date. Furthermore, you are occupying a heavy freighter slip." "I paid the heavy freighter tariff," Kevin said, keeping his voice deliberately quiet, deliberately slow. He wiped his greasy palms on his coveralls. The fabric was stiff with old engine oil. "The docking fee cleared my accounts 10 minutes ago." Brutus let out a sound like grinding stones. 2 of his 4 arms crossed over his armored chest. The other 2 rested on the heavy, electro-stun baton clipped to his harness. "A clerical error. You are a Class 2 organism. Soft, fragile. You lack the mass to command this much spatial volume. It is offensive to the dock workers to see such a small, weak thing taking up a sovereign slip." Around them, a handful of other dock workers, hulking brutes hauling crates that weighed as much as Kevin's entire cockpit, paused to watch. They chattered among themselves, a chorus of clicking mandibles and low guttural hisses. The translation earpiece Kevin wore caught fragments. Snap his spine with 2 fingers. Looks like a peeled larvae. Crush it if it speaks out of turn. Kevin felt a hot prickle of humiliation at the base of his neck, warring instantly with the sheer, exhausting reality of the situation. He didn't feel defiant. He felt tired. His lower back ached from sleeping in the pilot's chair, and his mouth tasted like stale coffee. He didn't want to prove human superiority. He just wanted to get clearance, sleep for 10 hours in his cramped bunk, and leave this miserable station. "Look, Brutus," Kevin said, forcing a steady breath out through his nose. "I'm not looking for a debate on biometrics. I'm an independent contractor. I'm just passing through. What's the fine? What's the bribe? Just give me a number so I can cycle my engines and leave." Brutus leaned in closer. The sheer heat radiating off the alien scales was oppressive. "It is not a matter of currency, little human. It is a matter of protocol. Your vessel must be manually inspected. By me. And if I find your cargo insecure, or your environmental systems a threat to this station, I will impound the ship." Kevin's stomach plummeted. Impounding the ship meant being stranded. It meant losing the contract. It meant starving on a station where the locals considered him roughly equivalent to a mildly annoying insect. "Fine," Kevin said, his voice cracking slightly. He hated himself for the crack. He cleared his throat. "Fine, inspect it. Just make it quick." Brutus clicked a laugh. It sounded like dry bones rattling in a tin can. "Oh, we will take our time, little runt. We will take our time." The ramp of Kevin's freighter, the dusty Horizon, lowered with an agonizingly slow groan of hydraulic protest. The metal was scarred and pitted from micrometeorite strikes, bleeding rust at the seams. To Kevin, it was home. To the 3 massive aliens stepping onto it, it was a joke. Brutus led the boarding party, flanked by 2 enforcers whose translated names registered on Kevin's HUD as Goliath and Titan. They stomped up the graded ramp, their heavy clawed feet making the entire ship shudder. Kevin trailed behind them, feeling distinctly like a child following angry adults into his own bedroom. The airlock cycled open, and the interior of the ship hit them. The dusty Horizon didn't smell like the sterile, ozone-scrubbed corridors of a military vessel. It smelled like humanity. It smelled like worn leather, spilled engine grease, cheap synthetic noodles, and a sharp, earthy musk that Kevin had long ago gone completely nose-blind to. Brutus recoiled immediately, 2 of his hands coming up to cover the olfactory slits on his snout. "Repulsive," the synthesizer blared. "The atmosphere is saturated with biological contaminants, shed skin, dander, a pungent feral odor. Do you sleep in your own filth, human?" "It's just stale air," Kevin lied softly, his heart rate ticking up another notch. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets so the aliens wouldn't see his fingers trembling. He knew what that smell was. He just prayed the source of it was currently asleep in the aft quarters. "We are searching the cargo hold," Goliath hissed, pushing past Kevin. The alien shoulder violently clipped Kevin's arm, sending the human staggering into the bulkhead. Pain flared up Kevin's shoulder, sharp and hot. He gasped, grabbing his arm, his boots scrambling for purchase on the deck plates. He hit the metal wall hard enough to rattle his teeth. He bit his tongue, the coppery taste of blood instantly flooding his mouth. "Watch your footing, fragile," Brutus mocked, not even turning around. The gravity plating here is set too high for your weak bones. We should snap a few to see how much pressure it takes. Kevin spat a mouthful of pink saliva onto the floor, grating. The anger finally pushed through the exhaustion, a hot, dark spike in his chest. But logic slammed down on it hard. Do not engage. Do not fight. They will tear your arms off and beat you to death with them. He limped after them as they pushed into the primary cargo bay. The bay was poorly lit, the fluorescent tubes overhead buzzing angrily and casting long, strobe-like shadows. Crates of coolant were stacked 3 high, secured with heavy cargo netting. Titan pulled out a handheld biometric scanner. It hummed loudly, casting a harsh green grid light over the crates. Scanning for contraband. Scanning for prohibited biologicals. Kevin held his breath. He watched the green light sweep over the deck plates, up the walls, towards the darkened access corridor that led to the engineering block. You humans, Brutus said, idly dragging a massive razor-sharp claw along the metal hull, carving a deep, screeching groove into the bulkhead. The sound made Kevin wince. You spread across the sector like a mold, tiny, defenseless, lacking natural armor, lacking venom, lacking strength. How your species survived its own cradle world is a mystery to the galactic scientific community. You are prey, built to hide, built to run. We're stubborn, Kevin muttered, rubbing his bruised shoulder. Brutus turned, his 4 eyes locking onto Kevin. The alien stepped forward, his massive frame boxing Kevin into a corner between 2 coolant crates. The smell of ammonia was suffocating. Stubbornness does not stop a jaw from crushing your skull. Stubbornness does not mend a severed spine. I think I will impound this ship. I think I will list you as lost in transit. I am tired of looking at you. Kevin froze. The air in his lungs vanished. This wasn't an inspection anymore. It was an execution. He looked at the heavy stun baton on Brutus's hip, then down at his own empty, grease-stained hands. Panic, raw and icy, seized his stomach. He was going to die here, in the dark, bleeding out on a dirty deck plate, millions of light years from a sun he recognized. Wait, Kevin said, his voice entirely devoid of pride. Please, take the cargo. Just let me take the escape pod. You can have the ship. Brutus raised a hand, the claws extending with a sickening snicked sound. I will have both. Beep, beep, beep. The frantic, high-pitched shrill of the biometric scanner suddenly cut through the heavy tension. Titan slapped the side of the device, his multi-jointed fingers scrambling over the controls. Commander, Titan clicked, his voice suddenly stripped of its sneering arrogance. The synthesizer struggled to translate the sudden drop in pitch. Commander, the scanner. Brutus didn't look away from Kevin. What is it? A biological red. Immense. It just woke up. Kevin closed his eyes. Oh, God. What are you talking about? Brutus snapped, finally turning his massive head. It's a human ship. There is only the human. No, Titan said, backing away from the dark corridor leading to engineering. The green light of his scanner was flashing rapidly, turning a violent, strobing red. Bone density is off the charts. Muscle mass is impossible. The predatory markers, the forward-facing visual cortex. Commander, the jaw pressure metrics on this reading, it can crush starship hull plating. Brutus lowered his claws. A stowaway? A feral xenobeast? Click, click, click. The sound wasn't alien mandibles. It was the heavy, rhythmic tapping of thick keratin nails on metal grating, coming from the dark corridor. Kevin slumped against the bulkhead, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. He wasn't scared anymore. He was just embarrassed. The temperature in the cargo bay seemed to drop 10 degrees. The three massive Vaxiri warriors froze, their natural predator instincts instantly hijacked by a terrifying ancient alarm bell ringing in their hindbrains. The tapping grew louder. Click, click, click. It was accompanied by a sound. A low, wet snuffling, like a massive bellows drawing in air, analyzing the foreign scents that had invaded its territory. Then came the rumble. It didn't sound like a roar. It sounded like an earthquake. It was a deep, guttural, bass-heavy vibration that resonated through the metal floor and rattled the loose tools in Kevin's belt. It was the sound of a very large, very displeased apex predator. Out of the shadows of the corridor stepped Duke. Duke was an English mastiff. On Earth, he was a giant breed, tipping the scales at 230 pounds of dense, unyielding muscle, thick bone, and loose, drooly jowls. To a human, he was a massive, lazy couch potato who was afraid of the vacuum cleaner. But to the Vaxiri, who evolved in a low-gravity environment where apex predators were lithe, brittle, and stealthy, Duke was a biological nightmare. Duke stood 36 inches at the shoulder. His chest was as wide as a fuel barrel. His massive block of a head slowly panned across the room, his dark, forward-facing eyes locking instantly onto the three towering aliens. The fur along his spine, thick, coarse, and fawn-colored, was standing straight up. He pulled his black lips back, exposing teeth that, while not razor-sharp, were thick, blunt instruments designed by thousands of years of selective breeding to hold down bulls and bears. He let out another growl. A thick rope of drool snapped from his jowl and hit the floor. "Gods of the deep," Goliath whispered, his forearms trembling. He dropped his stun baton. It clattered against the grating. Duke's ears twitched at the sound. He took one heavy, deliberate step forward. Brutus backed up so fast he slammed into a cargo crate. His previous swagger evaporated, replaced by sheer, rigid terror. The biological scanner in Titan's hand was screaming now, a continuous shrill tone. "The mass!" Titan stammered, his mandibles clicking erratically. "It's pure kinetic muscle. Look at the cranial structure. It's built for blunt force trauma. It's a heavy gravity apex killer." Kevin pushed himself off the wall. He winced as his shoulder throbbed, walking slowly out of the corner. He looked at the three aliens, who were now plastered against the far wall, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The 8-foot-tall terrors of the dock were trembling like leaves. "I told you the biological shielding was fine," Kevin said tiredly. Brutus stared at Kevin, his four eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound confusion. "Human, do not move. Do not draw its attention. If we remain perfectly still, perhaps it will not sense our thermal signatures." Kevin sighed. He rubbed his face with a grease-stained hand. "He can smell you, Brutus. You smell like an open bottle of window cleaner." "Do not speak to it," Goliath hissed, his voice pitching high with panic as Duke took another step forward, his massive head lowering, a deep bark building in his chest. Woof! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't a warning, it was a physical blow. The sheer decibel level forced the aliens to cover their auditory slits, cowering backward. Titan actually whimpered. "All right, that's enough," Kevin said sharply. He didn't yell. He used the exact same firm, slightly annoyed tone he used when the ship's comms array acted up. Brutus stared at Kevin as if the human had just decided to swallow a live thermal detonator. "Are you insane? It will tear you to pieces." Kevin ignored the giant alien. He walked right into the space between the 8-foot-tall trembling Vaxiri and the 230-pound mountain of muscle. He didn't cower. He didn't hesitate. He reached out a hand. "Duke, sit." The apex predator, the heavy-gravity killing machine that had just sent 3 station enforcers into a primal panic, stopped growling. The terrifying forward-facing eyes blinked. Duke looked at Kevin. Then, with a heavy dramatic sigh that sounded exactly like a deflating tire, the massive beast folded his hind legs and planted his enormous rear end on the metal grating. The terrifying jaws opened not to bite, but to let out a massive wet pant. His tail, as thick as a lead pipe, began to thump lazily against the floor. Thud, thud, thud. Kevin reached down and scratched the beast roughly behind the ears. Duke leaned into the touch, his eyes rolling back slightly in pleasure, another string of drool falling onto Kevin's boot. "Good boy," Kevin murmured, before turning back to look at the 3 aliens. There was a dead, absolute silence in the cargo bay, save for the heavy panting of the dog and the dull thud of his tail. Brutus was paralyzed. His brain, wired for dominance and the strict hierarchy of size and power, was violently short-circuiting. He looked at the monstrous, bone-crushing beast. Then he looked at the soft, frail, fleshy little human who had just commanded it with a single, quiet word. "You," Brutus choked out, his translation collar struggling to find the words. "You control this devastation?" Kevin looked down at Duke, who was currently trying to lick a grease stain off his own front paw. "Control is a strong word," Kevin said, his voice flat and perfectly cynical. "Mostly, I just pay for his food and pick up his crap. But, yeah, he listens to me, most of the time." Titan lowered the scanner, his hands shaking violently. "It submitted to you, a creature with that much raw, destructive potential. It submitted to a Class 2 fragile." "I'm not fragile," Kevin said, the annoyance returning, sharper this time. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the exhaustion and the throbbing pain in his shoulder where Goliath had shoved him. He looked up at Brutus, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just tired, and I want to go to sleep. So, are we done with the inspection, Commander? Or do you want to impound my ship?" Brutus stared at the dog. Duke suddenly stopped licking his paw, looked up at Brutus, and let out a soft, inquiring boof. Brutus flinched so hard, he nearly cracked his own scales against the bulkhead. The inspection is concluded," Brutus said quickly, edging his way along the wall toward the airlock, keeping maximum distance between himself and the dog. Goliath and Titan were already practically sprinting for the exit, their bravado entirely gone. "Your transit papers will be stamped. Immediate clearance." "Good," Kevin said. He patted Duke's heavy side. "See them out, buddy." Duke stood up, shaking his massive head, his heavy jowls making a wet, slapping sound. He took one step toward the aliens. The 3 Vaxiri didn't walk out of the ship. They scrambled. They tripped over each other in their desperate haste to get through the airlock, their heavy boots clattering frantically against the ramp. In seconds, they were gone, fleeing across the docking bay as if the devil himself had been uncaged behind them. Kevin stood in the quiet cargo bay, listening to the heavy pneumatic hiss of the airlock sealing shut. The red light on his console flipped to a steady, beautiful green. Clearance granted. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. His knees suddenly felt like water. He leaned heavily against a coolant crate, rubbing his throbbing temples. Duke padded over, his heavy nails clicking on the metal. He shoved his massive, blocky head right into Kevin's groin, nearly knocking the human over, and looked up with big, soulful brown eyes. "You're an idiot, you know that?" Kevin muttered, sinking to his knees and wrapping his arms around the dog's thick, warm neck. It smelled like wet fur and old corn chips, and to Kevin, it was the best smell in the galaxy. "A big, drooly idiot," Duke whined softly, licking the smear of blood off Kevin's chin with a tongue the size of a dinner plate. Kevin laughed, a dry, raspy sound that echoed in the empty bay. The aliens thought humans were frail. They thought they were weak. They didn't understand that humanity hadn't conquered the stars by being the strongest predator in the dark. They conquered the stars because they were crazy enough to look at the apex predators, pet them on the head, and call them good boys. The dusty horizon detached from the docking umbilicus with a violent, metallic shudder that rattled Kevin's teeth. He sat in the pilot's seat, gripping the dual thrust yoke so tightly his knuckles were stark white. His breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. Through the scratchy permaglass of the cockpit canopy, Outpost 44 looked like a rusted iron tumor clinging to the side of a dead asteroid. Usually, departure control would be buzzing in his ear, a chorus of irritable alien voices demanding vector adjustments and spewing fines for venting plasma too close to the gantry. Today, the comms channel was dead silent. Kevin pushed the starboard yoke forward. The primary thrusters ignited with a deep, vibrating bass note that resonated in the hollows of his chest. He didn't check the rear-view opticals. He didn't want to see if Brutus or any of the other Vaxiri were watching him leave. He just wanted the blackness of deep space. "Navcomp," Kevin said, his voice raspy and dry. He swallowed hard, tasting bile and old copper. "Calculate the jump to the Typhon sector. Maximum burn. Just get us the hell out of this gravity well." The console beeped a sluggish affirmative. The star field outside the canopy began to stretch, the pinpricks of light smearing into long, iridescent streaks as the hyperdrive spooled up. A low-frequency whine built up in the deck plates, culminating in a heavy, muffled thump. The ship lurched forward. Outpost 44 vanished. They were in the slipstream. The moment the stars stabilized into the swirling blue-gray tunnel of hyperspace, the adrenaline that had been keeping Kevin upright simply evaporated. It didn't fade. It pulled the plug. His hands began to shake. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead, stinging his eyes. The pain in his left shoulder, muted by terror down in the cargo bay, suddenly flared into a screaming hot agony. He let go of the controls, his fingers cramping into tight claws, and leaned forward until his forehead hit the edge of the navigation console. "Christ," he wheezed, the words slipping out of him like a punctured tire. He stayed there for a long time, just breathing the stale, recycled air, listening to the rhythmic hum of the life support scrubbers. He felt incredibly small. The vast, crushing reality of what had almost happened pressed down on him. He wasn't a fighter. If Duke hadn't woken up from his nap, Kevin would currently be a broken pile of meat on a dirty floor grating, and his ship would be stripped for parts. A heavy, wet nose bumped against his elbow. Kevin turned his head, not lifting it from the console. Duke was standing next to the pilot's chair. The massive English Mastiff had squeezed his 230-pound frame through the narrow bulkhead door, leaving a trail of fawn-colored fur on the metal grating. He looked at Kevin, his massive head tilted slightly to the side, his jowls hanging loose. To the Vaxiri, those forward-facing eyes were the mark of a ruthless, calculating apex killer. To Kevin, they just looked empty. Duke had the raw processing power of a mildly confused brick. The dog let out a soft whine, followed immediately by a wet, rumbling burp that smelled strongly of the synthetic meat paste Kevin had fed him yesterday. "You're a biological weapon, huh?" Kevin muttered, reaching over with his good arm to scratch the thick folds of skin on Duke's neck. "A heavy-gravity kinetic killer." Duke leaned into the scratch with so much weight that the pilot's chair creaked ominously. He closed his eyes, his back leg coming up to thump a lazy rhythmic beat against the deck. Thump, thump, thump. Kevin finally pushed himself up. He hissed as the movement pulled at his bruised shoulder. He needed a painkiller, and he needed a shower. But mostly, he needed to stop his hands from shaking. He unbuckled his harness and stood up. His left knee popped loudly in the quiet cabin. He limped out of the cockpit, stepping over Duke, who had immediately decided to lie down directly in the center of the narrow corridor, effectively blocking it completely. "Move, you giant rug!" Kevin grumbled, prodding the dog's ribs with his boot. Duke let out a huff, completely unbothered, and rolled onto his back, exposing a broad, pink-spotted belly. His thick tail thumped once against the wall. He wasn't moving. Kevin stepped over him, his boot squelching slightly on a fresh puddle of drool on the grating. In the cramped washroom, Kevin stripped off the oil-stained coveralls. He avoided looking in the scratched steel mirror above the sink. He knew what he'd see. Bags under his eyes like bruised plums. Thinning brown hair plastered to his skull with sweat, and a sickly pale complexion that came from spending months completely shielded from actual sunlight. He twisted his neck to look at his left shoulder. An angry, mottled bruise the size of a dinner plate was already blooming across his collarbone and down his bicep. Deep purple and angry red, mirroring the heavy curve of the alien's armor. He opened the flimsy plastic mirror cabinet. Inside were 3 half-empty bottles of generic ibuprofen, a roll of biogauze, and a tube of generic industrial burn cream. He dry swallowed 3 of the pills, the chalky coating catching in his throat. He stood under the sonic shower, letting the high-frequency vibrations strip the grease and sweat from his skin. It wasn't water. Water was too heavy and precious to waste on basic hygiene. But it felt good enough. It numbed the throbbing in his shoulder to a dull, manageable ache. When he stepped out and pulled on a relatively clean gray t-shirt and loose cargo pants, he felt somewhat human again. Not a hero, just a guy hauling coolant. He walked back into the galley, stepping over the still-sleeping mountain of fur in the hallway. He pulled a foil packet of coffee substitute from the dispenser. He poured hot water into it, watching the brown powder stubbornly refuse to dissolve, clumping at the surface like mud. He took a sip. It tasted like roasted dirt and despair. "Perfect," Kevin whispered to the empty room. He sat down at the small metal table, the only piece of furniture in the galley. The ship hummed around him, safe, isolated. For the next 8 days, it would just be him, the warp drive, and the dog. No heavily armored thugs, no bureaucratic red tape. Just the quiet, boring tedium of transit. or so he thought. By day 4 of the jump to the Typhon sector, the adrenaline crash had fully morphed into a deep, lethargic boredom. The dusty horizon smelled overwhelmingly of wet dog and ozone. Duke had discovered a slow drip from a condensation pipe in the engineering bay and decided that the small puddle forming on the floor was his new personal watering hole. Despite his stainless steel bowl in the galley being full, he spent his days wandering from the puddle to his bed in the corner of the cockpit and back again, dragging a scent of mildew through the ship. Kevin spent his time in the co-pilot seat, his feet propped up on the navigation console, a data pad resting on his stomach. He was attempting to read a dense, incredibly dry manual on calibrating thermocouplers, mostly to numb his brain into taking a nap. Outside the canopy, the blue-gray swirl of the slipstream was hypnotic. It was a monotonous, unchanging tunnel of bent light. Then the ship screamed. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was the proximity alert, a jarring two-tone klaxon that tore through the quiet cabin like a physical assault. The ambient lighting instantly flipped from a soft, warm yellow to a harsh, strobing emergency red. Kevin jerked awake so fast he launched the data pad across the cabin. It shattered against the bulkhead. He scrambled upright, his bad knee protesting violently, his bruised shoulder screaming as he threw himself into the pilot's seat. "Report!" Kevin yelled, his fingers flying across the sensory keypads. The main console flickered, pulling data from the ship's exterior arrays. "Mass shadow detected," the ship's synthetic voice announced. "Slipstream destabilization imminent. Gravimetric tether engaged from external source." "What the hell is a gravimetric tether?" Kevin demanded, scanning the readouts. The numbers didn't make sense. Someone, or something, was actively dragging them out of hyperspace. You couldn't just yank a ship out of a slipstream. It took massive amounts of energy and highly illegal military-grade interdiction hardware. The blue-gray swirl outside the canopy suddenly warped, twisting into violent, nauseating spirals. The dusty horizon bucked wildly. In the corner, Duke let out a startled bark, scrambling to his feet. His claws sought purchase on the metal deck, but the artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. The dog slid sideways, his heavy bulk slamming into the wall with a dull thud. "Hold on, buddy," Kevin shouted, grabbing the main thruster yokes and pulling back hard, trying to fight the drag. It was useless. The freighter was a cargo hauler, not a blockade runner. The engines whined in high-pitched agony, the temperature gauges immediately spiking into the red. The slipstream tunnel collapsed. Real space slammed back into existence. The stars snapped back into static pinpricks. The sudden deceleration threw Kevin hard against his harness, driving the breath from his lungs. The ship spun lazily, drifting in the cold void, the primary engines automatically cutting out to prevent a reactor meltdown. Kevin coughed, fighting the wave of nausea that accompanied a forced drop. He blinked the dark spots out of his vision and looked through the canopy. Hanging in the blackness, less than 2 kilometers off his port bow, was a ship. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, lethal way. It was shaped like a spearhead, forged from dark, matte black metal that seemed to absorb the starlight. It bristled with communication arrays and heavy, forward-facing plasma batteries. The transponder signal was masked, but the hull markings were clear even at this distance. The jagged crimson crest of the Vaxiri Syndicate. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Kevin breathed, staring at the warship. It was a cruiser A ship that size didn't bother shaking down independent haulers for a few tons of coolant. It was hunting. The comms console lit up, a harsh, flashing yellow light. Incoming transmission. Forced override. Kevin didn't have a choice. The cruiser was already painting the dusty horizon with targeting lasers. Two distinct red dots danced across the scratched permaglass of the cockpit. He hit the receive button. The audio channel cracked with static, then cleared. Human vessel dusty horizon. The translated voice was smooth, devoid of the guttural clicking Brutus had used. It sounded cold, refined, and entirely devoid of empathy. Power down your defensive arrays and prepare for boarding. This is an independent vessel operating under free trade bylaws, Kevin said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. He leaned close to the mic. You have illegally interdicted my flight path. State your intentions. A soft, synthesized chuckle echoed over the speakers. Bylaws. How quaint. We do not care about your coolant, human, and we do not care about your life. Kevin glanced at the sensor readouts. The cruiser was deploying a boarding tube, a massive segmented tunnel extending from its hull like a mechanical leech, reaching out to latch onto his airlock. Then what do you want? Kevin asked, his hand drifting down beneath the console, feeling blindly for the heavy steel wrench he kept wedged near the floorboards. It was a pathetic weapon against armored aliens, but he wasn't going to just stand there. Commander Brutus submitted a very interesting report before you departed Outpost 44, the voice purred. He claimed a Class 2 fragile was in possession of a Class 9 biokinetic weapon, a heavy-gravity apex predator, an unregistered, highly illegal life form capable of crushing heavy armor. Kevin froze. He looked over his shoulder. Duke was standing near the doorway, looking highly offended. He shook his massive head, his ears flapping loudly. He walked over to Kevin, let out a massive yawn that exposed his blunt, slobbery teeth, and rested his heavy chin firmly on Kevin's knee. He looked up, his tail giving a single, slow wag. Thud. You interdicted a freighter in deep space, Kevin said, a hysterical, bubbling laugh threatening to break loose in his chest. You pulled me out of hyperspace. For my dog? We claim the kinetic weapon for the Syndicate, the voice stated, the boarding tube locking onto the hull with a massive, echoing clang that reverberated through the entire ship. Surrender the beast, and we will leave you sufficient life support to wait for a rescue tug. Resist, and we will vaporize you and retrieve the weapon from the wreckage. The comms channel clicked off. The heavy metallic stomping of boots began to echo from the airlock corridor. Kevin looked down at Duke. Duke snorted, a bubble of spit forming on his lip. All right, Kevin whispered, his grip tightening on the heavy wrench until his knuckles ached. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, desperate clarity. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. But they weren't taking his dog. Let's see how much they like heavy gravity. The dusty horizon groaned as the Syndicate cruiser's boarding umbilical fully locked onto the outer airlock. It wasn't a clean connection. The sheer magnetic force of the clamps warped the freighter's outer hull, sending a shower of rusted metal flakes drifting past the permaglass canopy. Kevin's hands were slick with cold sweat. He wiped them on his cargo pants, leaving dark, greasy smears, and gripped the heavy steel wrench. It was 32 inches of solid forged earth iron designed for torquing primary engine bolts. It weighed 15 pounds. Right now, it felt like a toothpick. Ship, Kevin rasped, his throat tight. He swallowed, forcing his vocal cords to work. Reroute primary life support to the bridge and engineering. Cut atmospheric circulation to the central corridor. And override safety protocols on the artificial gravity plating in sectors 2 through 4. Warning, the ship's synthetic voice chimed, infuriatingly calm. Manual override of gravimetric plating requires authorization. Exceeding standard biological thresholds may result in structural stress. Authorization Kevin 9 Echo, he barked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Set plating to 1.5 Earth standard. Confirmed. Adjusting. The deck beneath Kevin's boots suddenly felt like it was pulling at his soles. His bad left knee gave a sharp, agonizing twinge, forcing him to lean heavily against the navigation console. 1.5 Gs wasn't lethal to a human, but it was deeply uncomfortable. It felt like walking around with a second person strapped to your back. The blood rushed to his legs, making his head spin momentarily. But for the Vaxiri, who were built like 8-foot-tall praying mantises with hollowed-out bone structures meant for low-gravity leaping, it was going to feel like wading through wet cement. "Duke," Kevin said, looking at the Mastiff. The dog was standing in the center of the cramped bridge, his head lowered. The lazy, drooly demeanor had vanished. The fur along his spine was fully raised, a jagged ridge of coarse hair from his neck to his tail. He wasn't barking. He was emitting a continuous low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the metal floorboards. He knew something was wrong. Dogs always knew. "Stay behind me," Kevin whispered, limping toward the heavy blast door that separated the bridge from the main corridor. He hit the manual release. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Kevin killed the corridor lights, plunging the ship's spine into absolute, suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the intermittent, strobing red flash of the emergency floor strips. He didn't hide behind a crate. He wasn't a soldier pulling an ambush. He just backed into the narrow alcove housing the water recycler, clutching the wrench to his chest, trying to control the ragged whistling sound of his own breathing. The air already smelled like fear, a sharp, acrid scent of nervous sweat and adrenaline. Clang. The outer airlock cycled. The sound echoed down the metal hallway. Hiss. The inner door blew open. "Atmospheric pressure is anomalous," a synthesized Vaxiri voice clicked, echoing in the dark corridor. "Gravity is severely elevated. Commander Brutus was correct. The human's environment is hostile." "Engage magnetic boots," another voice snapped. "Sweep the hold, find the bioweapon, kill the fragile." Heavy metallic footsteps clattered onto the grating. 3 of them. Kevin squeezed his eyes shut. His shoulder throbbed in time with his racing pulse. "They're going to kill me," a small, terrified voice whispered in his brain. "They have plasma rifles. You have a wrench." He gripped the iron tighter, the cold metal biting into his palms. The Vaxiri moved down the corridor. Their thermal optics cut through the darkness, sweeping the walls with faint, spectral green beams. But they were moving wrong. The 1.5 gravity was dragging on them. Their joints, designed for explosive, leaping movements, were fighting the immense, constant downward pull. Their footsteps weren't the sharp, predatory clicks Kevin had heard on the station. They were dragging, heavy, and exhausted. A green laser sight swept over the edge of the water recycler, inches from Kevin's face. "Thermal signature detected," the lead syndicate soldier hissed. "Alcove, 3 meters." Now, Kevin didn't think. If he thought about it, he would have frozen. He just pushed off the bulkhead with his good leg, throwing his entire body weight forward into the corridor. The Syndicate soldier was massive, clad in matte black armor that absorbed the red emergency lights. He was raising a heavy, multi-barreled rifle, his 4 eyes locking onto Kevin. Kevin swung the wrench like a baseball bat. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the center of mass. The 15-pound iron wrench, accelerated by Kevin's desperate, adrenaline-fueled swing and compounded by the heavy gravity, slammed into the alien's lower thoracic plating. The impact shuddered up Kevin's arms, jarring his teeth. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a pane of frosted glass. The Vaxiri armor, designed to dissipate high-energy plasma scoring, was entirely unprepared for blunt force kinetic trauma. The breastplate shattered. The alien let out a horrific, high-pitched screech, its mandibles clicking wildly as it was thrown backward by the sheer physical momentum of the strike. It crashed into the bulkhead, dropping its rifle. "Human!" the second soldier roared, spinning awkwardly, struggling against the heavy gravity to bring its weapon to bear. Kevin tried to swing again, but his momentum was gone. The wrench dragged against the floorboards. His lungs burned. He was out of breath after a single swing. He stumbled, his bad knee buckling under the extra gravity, and fell hard onto the metal grating, scraping the skin off his palms. The second alien aimed the rifle directly at Kevin's chest. The muzzle glowed a blinding, lethal blue. Kevin raised a hand, a pathetic, instinctual gesture to block a blast that would vaporize his torso. Then the darkness behind Kevin exploded. It wasn't a tactical strike. It was a freight train made of bone and muscle. Duke didn't leap. Mastiffs don't leap. He charged. 230 pounds of heavy-gravity apex predator, unbothered by the 1.5 G environment that was currently crippling the aliens, surged out of the bridge. His thick claws found perfect traction on the metal grating. He hit the second Vaxiri soldier just below the knees. The sound was sickening. A wet, hollow snap echoed down the corridor as the alien's elongated, bird-like legs buckled entirely backward under the massive impact. The soldier didn't even have time to scream before Duke's momentum carried them both into the opposite wall. The plasma rifle discharged wildly, blowing a scorching hole through the ceiling panels and raining sparks down on them. "Get it off! Get it off!" the soldier shrieked, the translation collar producing a chaotic stream of panicked static. Duke didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply opened his massive, blocky jaws and clamped down on the alien's primary combat arm. Earth evolution is a cruel, pragmatic thing. The Mastiff breed possessed a bite force of over 500 pounds per square inch. Their jaws were designed to grab hold of enraged bulls and not let go, no matter how violently the prey thrashed. The Syndicate armor cracked like an eggshell. Dark, viscous violet blood sprayed across the grating. The third alien, standing near the airlock, froze. Complete biological paralysis. The sight of the monstrous furry beast crushing its squad mate's armored limb with nothing but its jaws broke the Vaxiri's predatory conditioning. "Shoot it!" the pinned alien screamed, thrashing wildly, its free arms beating uselessly against Duke's thick, muscular neck. The blows sank into the loose folds of skin and heavy fat, doing absolutely nothing to deter the dog. Duke just shifted his weight, pinning the alien firmly to the floor, his jaws locked shut, his massive head shaking once, violently side to side. Another sickening crack. The alien went limp, unconscious from the shock and pain. Duke released the arm, his muzzle painted with violet blood. He turned his massive, blocky head toward the third soldier. A thick rope of violet-stained drool fell from his jowl and sizzled faintly on the grating. He let out a single, thunderous woof that rattled the loose panels in the walls. The third soldier didn't raise its weapon. It didn't try to save its squad mates. It dropped its plasma rifle, spun around, and clawed frantically at the airlock controls. "Retreat! Abort!" It screamed into its comms unit, its hands shaking so badly it could barely hit the decompression sequence. Kevin pushed himself up off the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were bleeding, his knee was on fire, and his ears were ringing from the plasma discharge. He grabbed the dropped plasma rifle from the floor. It was absurdly heavy and awkward in his grip, but he pointed it at the fleeing alien. "Tell your cruiser to detach the umbilical," Kevin yelled, his voice cracking violently. He coughed, tasting copper. "Tell them to detach right now, or I blow this airlock open and suck us all into the void." The alien didn't look back. The inner airlock doors slid open. The soldier scrambled inside, dragging its shattered comrade by the harness, completely ignoring the first alien Kevin had hit with the wrench, who was still groaning weakly against the wall. "Detaching! We are detaching!" the soldier shrieked, slamming the emergency seal button. The thick doors hissed shut, locking the syndicate soldiers inside the umbilical tube. A second later, the heavy vibrating clang of the magnetic clamps releasing echoed through the hull. The dusty horizon violently pitched to starboard as the cruiser forcibly shoved itself away, desperate to sever the connection to the ship carrying the nightmare beast. Kevin dropped the plasma rifle. It clattered onto the grating. He slid down the wall until he hit the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He was shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline was burning out of his system, leaving nothing but cold exhaustion and the sharp throbbing pain of his injuries. He stared down the dark corridor. The first alien he had hit was curled in a fetal position, clutching its shattered chest plate, making soft, wet clicking noises. "Ship," Kevin wheezed. "Restore gravity to normal. Turn the lights back on." The heavy, oppressive weight lifted instantly. The soft yellow ambient lighting flickered back to life. Duke stood in the middle of the corridor. He looked at the alien groaning on the floor. He sniffed it once, sneezed violently, probably from the ammonia smell of the blood, and then trotted over to Kevin. The massive dog squeezed his bulk into the narrow space next to Kevin. He didn't look like a biokinetic weapon anymore. He just looked like a very large, very tired dog. He shoved his bloody, drooly muzzle directly into Kevin's chest, leaving a massive stain on his t-shirt, and let out a long, heavy sigh. Kevin wrapped his shaking arms around the dog's thick neck. He buried his face in the coarse, fawn-colored fur, not caring about the smell of mildew or the alien blood. "Good boy," Kevin whispered, his voice breaking into a dry sob that he couldn't hold back. "Good boy, Duke." Duke's tail thumped against the metal wall. Thud, thud, thud. Outside the canopy, the massive, terrifying syndicate cruiser engaged its sublight engines, burning hard to put as much distance between itself and the tiny battered freighter as possible. They had come hunting prey, expecting a fragile, soft target. They didn't understand the cruel arithmetic of Earth's gravity, and they didn't understand the terrifying ancient pact between humanity and the beasts they brought with them into the dark. Kevin squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the steady, comforting sound of his dog's breathing. They were going to have a hell of a time cleaning the corridor, and the syndicate would probably put a bounty on his head from here to the core worlds. But as Duke shifted his weight, pinning Kevin's bad leg to the floor in a demand for belly scratches, Kevin couldn't find it in himself to care. They were alive, and out here in the cold, empty void, that was a victory. The silence that settled over the dusty horizon was heavier than the artificial gravity had been. Kevin sat on the floor of the central corridor for a long time, his back pressed against the cold metal bulkhead. He listened to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the sublight engines, pushing them deeper into the void, away from the jump point. His hands were shaking too badly to attempt re-engaging the hyperdrive just yet. The air in the corridor was foul. The ozone tang from the discharged plasma rifle lingered, sharp and metallic, burning the back of his throat. Beneath it was the suffocating, concentrated ammonia stench of Vaxiri blood. Kevin forced his eyes open. The red emergency lights had given way to the standard, sickly yellow halogens. It didn't make the scene any better. Violet fluid was pooled on the floor grating, thick and viscous. It clung to the metal in congealing, oily blobs. The blast from the plasma rifle had scorched a black, weeping crater into the ceiling panel, and melted wires hung down like dead vines, showering the floor with intermittent, lazy yellow sparks. "Right," Kevin whispered. The words sounded like sandpaper. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like a conqueror. He felt like a 42-year-old man who had just blown out his bad knee and now had to mop up alien blood before it oxidized and stained his deck plates permanently. He gripped the railing and pulled himself up. His left knee flared with a sickening hot spike of pain that made his vision swim. He hissed through his teeth, putting all his weight on his right leg. His shoulder, where the initial bruise had blossomed into a hardened, agonizing knot of torn muscle, throbbed in time with his racing pulse. Duke was lying 5 feet away, his massive head resting on his paws. The mastiff let out a deep, chest-rattling sigh. His fawn-colored muzzle was smeared with dark violet. Kevin limped toward the maintenance locker at the end of the hall. Every step was an argument with his own nervous system. He pulled out a heavy industrial push broom, a bucket, and a jug of chemical solvent designed for stripping grease off engine manifolds. He filled the bucket at the water recycler, the same alcove he had hidden in just 20 minutes ago. His reflection caught in the polished steel paneling. He looked like a corpse, pale, sweaty, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a dark smear of grease and rust across his forehead. He dragged the bucket back to the corridor. "Hey," Kevin said softly. Duke lifted his heavy head, his ears swiveled forward. Kevin dropped onto his good knee, wincing. He pulled a rag from his back pocket, dipped it into the bucket of water and solvent, and wrung it out. He reached out to the dog. Duke didn't pull away. He just blinked, his dark, soulful eyes staring right through Kevin. Kevin scrubbed the violet blood off the mastiff's jowls. The alien blood was sticky, clinging to the thick fur. Duke didn't seem to care. He leaned into the pressure, his tongue lolling out to lick Kevin's wrist. "Don't eat that," Kevin muttered, pulling his hand back. God knows what kind of heavy metals are in their hemoglobin. He checked the dog over. He ran his hands down Duke's thick neck, over his barrel chest, and down his legs. No burns, no broken skin. The kinetic impact that had shattered Vaxiri armor hadn't even bruised the dog. Duke was 230 pounds of dense, unyielding earth biology. He was built to survive. "You're okay," Kevin breathed, a heavy knot of anxiety finally unraveling in his chest. "You're okay, buddy," Duke snorted, shook his head violently, sending droplets of water flying, and then lumbered to his feet. He walked over to the nearest untouched patch of floor, circled 3 times, collapsed with a heavy thud, and closed his eyes. Within seconds, a soft, wet snore echoed in the hall. Kevin stared at the snoring mountain of fur. 3 heavily armed syndicate enforcers had just fled in absolute terror from a creature that was currently dreaming about chasing synthetic meat paste. Kevin grabbed the push broom. It took him 2 hours to clean the corridor. He swept the shattered, dark gray shards of Vaxiri armor into a pile, the pieces clinking hollowly against the dustpan. He scrubbed the violet blood with the harsh chemical solvent until the fumes made his eyes water and his lungs burn. He taped a piece of heavy plastic sheeting over the scorched ceiling panel to stop the sparking wires from dropping slag onto his boots. By the time he was done, his coveralls were soaked with sweat, and his knee was swollen to the size of a grapefruit. He limped back to the cockpit and collapsed into the pilot's chair. He didn't bother setting the nav comp properly. He just aligned the ship to the Typhon sector beacon, slapped the hyperdrive engagement lever, and closed his eyes as the stars smeared into the comforting, isolating blue-gray tunnel of the slipstream. He reached down blindly. His fingers found the thick, coarse fur of Duke's head. "Good boy," Kevin whispered to the empty cabin. He didn't open his eyes again for 12 hours. The dusty horizon dropped out of hyperspace 4 days later. Typhon Station was a massive, sprawling metropolis of spinning rings and neon-lit docking bays, hanging in orbit around a violently swirling gas giant. It was a hub for the outer rims, crowded, dirty, and chaotic. Usually, arriving here meant 3 hours of waiting in a holding pattern, followed by a screaming match with a synthesized traffic controller who wanted to fine Kevin for existing. Kevin sat in the pilot's seat, chewing on a stale ration bar that tasted like compressed sawdust. His left arm was in a makeshift sling crafted from a torn bedsheet. His knee was wrapped tight in a compression bandage, forcing him to keep his legs straight out under the console. He keyed the comms. "Typhon Control, this is the independent freighter Dusty Horizon, requesting a Class 4 slip for cargo offload. 3,000 tons of industrial coolant." He waited for the inevitable sigh, the static, the demand to hold position. The radio crackled instantly. "Freighter Dusty Horizon, this is Typhon Primary Control." The voice wasn't an automated drone. It was live, and it sounded incredibly, bizarrely tense. "We have you on our scopes. You are cleared for immediate docking at Premium Bay Alpha 1. Bypassing all holding patterns. Vector data is being transmitted to your nav comp now." Kevin stopped chewing. He stared at the comms array, Premium Bay Alpha 1. Those bays were reserved for corporate dreadnoughts and diplomatic envoys. The docking fees alone were usually more than Kevin's entire payload was worth. "Control," Kevin said slowly, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. "I didn't request a premium bay. I can't afford a premium bay. Put me in the lower rings." "Negative, Dusty Horizon," the voice cracked slightly. "The slip fee has been waived by the station authority. Please proceed to Alpha 1 immediately. A security cordon has already been established for your arrival." Kevin lowered his hand. He looked back at the cockpit door. Duke was wedged in the threshold, completely blocking the exit, chewing idly on a thick rubber wrench handle he had stolen from the engineering bay. The Syndicate cruiser. They must have dumped their sensor logs and internal comms into the sector's shadow net to explain why an entire boarding party had been routed by a single, unarmed freighter. Out here, information moved faster than light. The story of the fragile human hauling a Class 9 biokinetic apex killer had beaten him to Typhon. "Understood, Control," Kevin said, proceeding to Alpha 1. The docking process was eerily smooth. There were no near misses with reckless scavengers, no aggressive scans. The massive polished blast doors of Bay Alpha 1 slid open, revealing a cavernous, immaculately clean hangar. Kevin brought the ship down, the landing struts hitting the deck with a heavy metallic groan. He initiated the engine shutdown sequence, the deep hum of the reactor fading into silence. He unbuckled his harness. He grabbed a heavy canvas jacket from the back of the seat, struggling to pull it over his sling to hide the worst of the bruising. He didn't want to look like a victim. "Come on, Duke," Kevin said. The Mastiff spat out the chewed rubber handle, stretched until his joints popped, and lumbered after Kevin. The cargo ramp lowered with its usual rusted screech. The bright, sterile lights of the premium bay flooded the dark interior of the ship. Kevin walked down the ramp, his bad knee forcing a heavy, uneven limp. Duke walked right beside him, his massive shoulders brushing against Kevin's thigh. The dog was panting happily, oblivious to the tension, his thick tail wagging in slow, heavy sweeps. Waiting at the bottom of the ramp was the Typhon dockmaster. He wasn't a Vaxiri. He was a Krell, a squat, heavily built species that resembled an upright armadillo cast in bronze armor plating. Usually, the Krell were arrogant and deeply bureaucratic. This one was sweating profusely. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed station security guards. But the guards weren't looking at Kevin. They weren't even aiming their weapons. They had their rifles lowered, their backs pressed firmly against the far wall of the bay, trying to put as much physical distance between themselves and the ramp as possible. The dockmaster took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked onto Duke. "Captain," the dockmaster said, his voice trembling slightly. He bowed. It was a deep, formal gesture of total submission. "Welcome to Typhon Station. We are honored by your presence." Kevin stopped at the base of the ramp. He looked at the dockmaster, then at the terrified guards. He let out a long, slow breath. "I'm just here to drop off coolant," Kevin said, his voice flat. "Of course," the dockmaster said quickly, holding up a data pad. He didn't step any closer. "Your cargo has already been credited to your account, full price, plus a hazard bonus from the station authority for keeping the trade lanes clear of syndicate activity." Kevin blinked. He looked at his wrist comp. A notification chimed. The credit transfer was there. It was triple his usual rate. "We only ask one thing, Captain," the dockmaster continued, his gaze flicking nervously to Duke's massive, drooling jaws. Duke let out a soft whine, smelling the sterile station air, trying to figure out if there was a food vendor nearby. The sound made 2 of the security guards flinch violently. "What's that?" Kevin asked. The beast," the dockmaster stammered. "The apex killer. We ask that you keep it restrained. We do not have the structural shielding to contain a heavy gravity kinetic event if it becomes enraged." Kevin looked down at Duke. Duke sat heavily on the pristine floor, lifted his back leg, and began to aggressively scratch behind his ear. His collar jingled loudly in the quiet hangar. Kevin looked back at the terrified alien officials. A slow, deeply cynical smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He was exhausted. He was battered. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't the runt of the station. He reached down and patted Duke's thick, muscular head. "Don't worry," Kevin said, his voice steady and calm. "As long as nobody touches my ship, the beast stays quiet. Right, buddy?" Duke stopped scratching, let out a massive wet burp, and leaned his heavy weight entirely against Kevin's good leg. "Understood," the dockmaster whispered, bowing again. "The station is yours, Captain." Kevin adjusted his jacket over his sling. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a guy who finally had enough credits to fix his hyperdrive and buy a decent cup of coffee. He limped past the security detail, the heavy rhythmic clicking of Duke's claws echoing off the polished steel walls. The aliens pressed themselves flat against the bulkheads, holding their breath as the frail human and his planet-crushing monster walked by. Out in the dark, humanity was small, but they brought the gravity of Earth with them, one good boy at a time. If you loved seeing the galactic bullies realize exactly why humanity's best friend is a heavy-gravity nightmare, hit that like button and subscribe for more HFY Sci-fi stories. The universe might think we're small and fragile, but they severely underestimate the sheer kinetic power of a very good, very drooly boy. What Earth animal would you bring on a deep space freighter to keep the pirate syndicates in line? A mastiff? A honey badger? A flock of Canadian geese? Drop your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and ring that bell so you never miss a tale of human defiance. Stay safe out there in the void, and we'll see you in the next one.